She was 22 and owned nothing but the clothes on her back. Cast out by the only family she'd ever known, she had a single silver dollar, a worn wooden spoon, and a destination nobody wanted, a cursed homestead on the Nebraska prairie. They laughed when she bought it for that single coin. But what no one knew was that the first heavy rain would wash away a secret buried in the earth, a secret worth more than silver that would change her life forever. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from as we tell the story of Nettie Granger. Nettie Granger was not born to the Miller family, but she grew up in the shadow of their farmhouse, a fixture as unremarkable as a fence post. She had arrived at the age of 4, a ward of the county left by parents she could not remember, and the Millers, a family of stern, God-fearing farmers, had taken her in. It was an act of charity they never let her forget. She was not a daughter. She was an obligation, and her keep was earned from the moment she was tall enough to pluck eggs from a nesting box. Her childhood was a blur of chores dictated by the sun and the seasons. She learned to milk before she learned to write her full name, to churn butter, mend clothing, knead dough, and draw water until her arms ached with a man's strength. She slept on a pallet in a storage room that smelled of dried apples and mothballs, and she ate what was left after the family had finished their meal. There was no cruelty in it, not in the way the world thought of cruelty. There were no beatings or deliberate starvations. There was only a vast, unending absence of affection, a quiet, daily reinforcement that she was not one of them. She was simply there, useful, and therefore tolerated. Her only true teacher was a man named Silas, the miller's hired hand, a quiet widower with hands as gnarled as oak roots. He was a man of few words, but he saw the girl who watched everything. He saw her notice how he braced a loose gate post before it fell, how he checked the wind before deciding which field to burn, how he listened to the sound of the axles on the big wagon. While Mrs. Miller taught her the work of the house, Silas, without formal lessons, taught her the work of the world. He showed her how to read the clouds for rain, how to sharpen a blade on a whetstone, how to splice a rope so it was stronger than before. He taught her that a well-made thing had its own honesty. On her 10th birthday, he pressed a small, smooth object into her hand. It was a spoon, carved from a piece of pale, fine-grained maple. It was not fancy. It was perfectly balanced. The bowl scooped just so, the handle worn smooth to a soft sheen. "A thing for your own," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first gift she had ever received that was not a hand-me-down. The first thing that was hers alone. Silas passed from a lung fever 2 winters later, and Nettie was left with the spoon and the quiet competence he had nurtured in her. She kept the spoon tucked in her apron pocket, its smooth wood a constant, solid presence against her palm. She grew into a young woman who was capable, observant, and silent. She knew how to fix what was broken, how to make do with what was on hand, and how to endure. She asked for nothing and expected nothing, and in the rigid, unforgiving economy of the Miller farm, this was her greatest virtue. The end of her time at the Miller farm came not with a shout, but with a quiet conversation in Mr. Miller's cramped office, a room that smelled of ledgers and dry tobacco. It was a Tuesday in late spring, the air thick with the scent of freshly turned earth. Mr. Miller's eldest son, Thomas, was to be married in June. His intended, a merchant's daughter from town, had made it clear she would be the only woman running her new household. She did not want a hired girl of Nettie's age, a girl who was neither family nor formal staff, living under the same roof. It was a matter of propriety, she had insisted. Mr. Miller, a man who treated life as a series of transactions, saw the logic in it. He motioned for Nettie to sit on the hard wooden chair opposite his desk, a chair usually reserved for men looking to buy seed or sell livestock. He did not meet her eyes. He looked at the ledger in front of him, his finger tracing a line of figures. "Nettie," he began, his voice flat and final. "You have been with us for 18 years. You have been a good worker." He paused, clearing his throat. "But things are changing. Thomas is bringing home a wife. The house will be hers now." He slid a single, polished silver dollar across the worn surface of the desk. The coin spun for a moment before settling, its gleam stark against the dark wood. "This is for your service. It is time for you to make your own way." There was no room for argument. It was not a discussion. It was a decree. Nettie looked at the coin, then at the man who had been the closest thing to a father she had ever known. His face was a mask of impassive resolve. She had given him 18 years of her life, her childhood, her girlhood, her strength, and it was worth $1. She did not cry. She did not plead. The lessons of Silas and the long, silent years had taught her the futility of begging for what would not be freely given. She simply nodded. "I understand," she said, her voice even. She reached out, her fingers closing around the cool metal of the coin. She stood. "I will be gone by morning." That evening, she went about her chores as always. She milked the cows, fed the chickens, and banked the fire in the kitchen stove. She moved through the familiar spaces of the house, a ghost already departed. In the small storage room, she gathered her few possessions: a spare dress of faded calico, a small Bible given to her by a traveling preacher, a mending kit, and the worn wooden spoon from Silas. She wrapped them all in a rough wool blanket, making a tidy bundle. She did not sleep. She lay on her pallet, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the groans of the wood, the quiet breathing of the family in their warm beds. At the first hint of dawn, she rose, tied her bonnet under her chin, picked up her bundle and the single dollar in her pocket, and walked out the door without a backward glance. The prairie opened before her like a vast, empty sea. The sun, just breaking the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows across an earth that was relentlessly flat, broken only by the gentle swells of the land and the endless, whispering grass. Nettie walked east, toward the town of Providence, the only settlement of any size within a 3-day walk. The name was a hollow promise in the immense silence. The road was little more than 2 ruts carved into the dirt, a faint line stretching toward an invisible destination. The wind was the first thing she noticed, and the last. It was not a gentle breeze. It was a constant physical pressure, a tireless hand pushing against her, whipping strands of hair from her bonnet, and filling the air with a fine, gritty dust that coated her tongue and stung her eyes. It sawed through the tall grass with a sound like a great, indrawn breath that never ended. She walked with a steady, practiced rhythm, the gait of someone accustomed to long hours of physical labor. Her bundle, tied over her shoulder, was not heavy, but its weight was a constant reminder of how little she possessed. The silver dollar in her pocket felt both impossibly small and monumentally heavy. It was everything she had. By midday, the sun was high and merciless. There were no trees to offer shade, no hills to break the monotony. The sky was a huge, pale, and indifferent dome. Heat shimmered off the ground, making the horizon tremble. She drank sparingly from the small canteen she had filled at the miller's well, the water already tasting warm and metallic. Her feet, clad in sturdy but worn leather boots, began to ache. She felt a profound and unnerving smallness, a solitary figure adrift in the sheer scale of the landscape. It was a place that could swallow a person whole, erase them without a trace. Yet she did not feel fear. She felt a strange, quiet clarity. The emptiness of the land mirrored the emptiness of her life until that morning. There were no more orders to follow, no more meals to cook for others, no more silent judgments to endure. There was only the road, the sky, and the steady, rhythmic work of putting one foot in front of the other. As evening approached, the sky bled into hues of orange and violet. She left the road and found a shallow depression in the prairie, a place that offered a slight reprieve from the eternal wind. She unwrapped her blanket, ate a piece of dry bread she had saved from the previous day's baking, and lay down to rest. She clutched the wooden spoon in her hand, its familiar shape a comfort in the vast darkness. The stars came out, a brilliant, cold spray across a sky blacker than any she had ever seen. She was alone, utterly and completely, but for the first time in her life, she was also free. The thought did not bring her joy, not yet. It was too new, too raw. It was simply a fact, as solid and real as the hard ground beneath her and the silver dollar that represented the price of her past and the key to her future. She slept, and the wind sang its lonely song over her. She arrived in Providence on the third day, dusty and bone-weary. The town was a small, hopeful cluster of wooden buildings huddled together against the vastness of the prairie. Its main street a wide slash of churned mud and wagon ruts. It was a place of commerce and desperation, filled with farmers in worn denim, merchants with wary eyes, and the ever-present pall of dust kicked up by the wind. Nettie made her way to the United States Land Office, a small, unassuming clapboard building with a painted sign swinging crookedly from one hinge. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper and chewing tobacco. A man with a green eye shade and ink-stained fingers sat behind a high counter, scratching at a ledger with a pen. He glanced up, his expression one of bored indifference. "Help you?" he asked, not bothering to rise. Nettie approached the counter. "I'm looking to file on a piece of land," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The clerk, whose nameplate identified him as Mr. Henderson, looked her up and down. A young woman, alone, with a dusty bundle, and no man beside her. A faint, dismissive smirk touched his lips. "Got the funds? Proving up a claim takes capital, tools, seed, stock." He gestured vaguely with his pen. "It's not for... well, it's hard work." "I know what hard work is," Nettie replied, her gaze steady. "Are there any abandoned claims? Relinquishments?" Henderson's smirk widened into a grin. He leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "Funny you should ask. There is one. The old Albright place. Quarter section, 10 miles north of here. Has a soddy on it, a barn of sorts." He paused for dramatic effect. "Most folks won't touch it, say it's cursed." He leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "First owner Albright, he and his boy died in a fire. The wife left. Then another family, the Stensons, tried it last year. Lost 2 children to fever inside of a month. They packed up and fled in the middle of the night. Left everything. People say the land itself is sick." Nettie considered this. A cursed place was a cheap place. "What's the filing fee?" she asked. Henderson laughed, a short, sharp bark. "The government fee, $1. He watched her, expecting her to recoil, to leave. Instead, Nettie reached into her pocket and placed her single, heavy silver dollar on the counter. The clerk's laughter died in his throat. He stared at the coin, then back at her face, which was as calm and serious as if she were buying a sack of flour. "You're sure about this, miss?" he asked, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or disbelief in his eyes. "It's my dollar," she said. He shrugged, the moment of concern passing. It wasn't his problem. He took the dollar, slid a form across the counter, and dipped a pen in the inkwell for her. Nettie carefully signed her name, Antoinette Granger. An hour later, with a signed deed in her pocket and directions scrawled on a piece of scrap paper, she left the town behind and walked north. The homestead, when she finally reached it, was even more desolate than Henderson's description had suggested. The soddy was a low, slumped mound of earth, its roof patched with rotting canvas, and its one window a dark, vacant eye. A fire had blackened the western wall, leaving streaks of soot like old tear tracks. The barn leaned precariously, its timbers silvered and split by the sun and wind. A broken well pump stood sentinel over a dry, stone-lined hole. The only living things were the relentless prairie grass and a few stubborn thistles. It was a place of profound neglect and sorrow. Nettie stood before it, her bundle in her hand, and felt not despair, but a quiet sense of possession. It was broken. It was lonely. It was haunted by failure, but it was hers. The first weeks were a battle for inches. Nettie's life narrowed to a series of urgent physical tasks. Her first priority was shelter. The soddy's interior was damp and smelled of mildew and old smoke. She spent 2 days shoveling out the dirt floor, evicting spiders and a family of mice, and using salvaged planks from a collapsed corral to patch the worst of the holes in the roof. She used her own blanket to cover the empty window frame at night, a thin barrier against the ceaseless wind. The second priority was water. The well was dry, the pump's handle hanging limp and useless. For the first week, she made a 2-mile round trip each morning to a small creek, hauling back 2 buckets of silty water, a task that consumed precious time and energy. Her hands, already calloused, grew tougher, her back and shoulders solidifying with muscle. She was always tired, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that sleep never fully erased. She worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by a grim determination and the last of the bread she'd brought. She found a small patch of wild onions near the creek and ate them raw, their sharp bite a welcome change from the stale taste of her dwindling supplies. The land was hard and unforgiving, but she was harder. Then, in the 3rd week, the sky changed. The pale, washed-out blue deepened to a bruised purple-gray. The wind, for the first time, fell silent. An unnerving stillness settled over the prairie. Nettie, remembering Silas's lessons, secured the canvas on her roof and brought her few belongings to the driest corner of the soddy. The rain began not as a drizzle, but as a sudden, violent onslaught. It came down in solid gray sheets, hammering the sod roof and turning the dusty ground to instant mud. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and lightning bleached the world white for a heart-stopping second. It rained all afternoon and all through the night, a relentless deluge that seemed determined to wash the world clean. Nettie sat in the dark, listening to the roar, a small leak dripping steadily into a tin cup she'd found. The next morning, the world was transformed. The air was cool and clean, and the prairie was a glistening, sodden green. A small lake had formed in the low-lying area behind the leaning barn. As Nettie stepped outside, the damp earth squelching under her boots, she saw it. The ground, a dozen yards from the barn, had given way. A ragged, circular hole, 10 feet across, had opened in the earth, its edges a mess of collapsed turf and dark, wet soil. It was a sinkhole, created by the immense volume of water. Cautiously, she approached the edge. The hole was deep, perhaps 15 feet, and at the bottom, something moved. It was water, bubbling up from the earth, clear and clean. The flood had breached an underground spring, but it was the walls of the sinkhole that held her attention. They were not just dirt. Streaked through the dark soil were thick, glittering white veins. They looked like frost or quartz, but she knew, with a sudden, heart-pounding certainty, what they were. She scrambled down the slippery side of the hole, heedless of the mud. She broke off a piece of the white crust. It was crystalline, cool to the touch. She lifted it to her tongue. The taste was sharp, unmistakable. Salt. A massive, pure deposit of it, exposed to the world. And then she saw something else. Tucked into a small niche in the rock wall, just above the new water line, was a metal box, rusted but intact. It had been wrapped in oilcloth, which had mostly rotted away. She pried it open with her fingers. Inside, protected from the damp, was a leather-bound journal. On the first page, in a neat, deliberate hand, was a letter. It began, "To whoever finds this in the year of our Lord, 1878, my name is Elias Albright. I was a geologist before I was a farmer. This land is not cursed. It is blessed. Beneath your feet lies a salt vein of uncommon purity. I was building a system to extract it when my barn burned. It was not an accident. I believe my neighbors, the Rankin brothers, suspected my discovery and sought to drive me out. They are dangerous men. This spring and this salt are your inheritance, if you are wise enough to hold it. Godspeed." The letter from Elias Albright changed everything. It was not just a confirmation of the salt. It was a warning, a legacy, and a charge. Nettie sat on the damp ground beside the newly born spring, the open journal in her lap, and read the words over and over. The world, which had been a simple, brutal equation of survival, suddenly became complex and dangerous. She was no longer just a homesteader fighting the elements. She was the guardian of a secret, a treasure that had already cost one man his life. Her first thought was of the Rankin brothers. She did not know them, but the name was a cold stone in her gut. Men who would burn a barn would not hesitate to do worse. Her isolation, once a simple fact of geography, now felt like a profound vulnerability. She knew she could not work the salt, could not profit from it, alone and unprotected. Her mind, sharpened by years of practical problem-solving, began to work. She needed to secure her claim, not just on paper, but physically. She needed tools, lumber, and allies, and she needed to do it without revealing the true value of what lay beneath her land. She carefully rewrapped the journal in the remnants of its oilcloth, hid it deep within the walls of her soddy, and made a plan. The next morning, she walked back to Providence. This time, she did not go to the land office. She sought out the town's blacksmith, a man named Abe Abernathy. His forge was at the edge of town, a smoky, clangorous place that smelled of hot metal and coal. Abernathy was an older man, built like the anvils he worked, with a reputation for being honest to a fault and wary of gossip. Nettie found him hammering a glowing piece of iron into a plowshare. She waited until he was finished. "Mr. Abernathy," she said. He turned, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm. He recognized her as the girl who'd bought the Albright place. "The big rain," she said, by way of explanation. "It opened up a new spring on my land, a good one, but the ground is soft around it. I need to build a proper well house, to shore it up before it collapses." She did not mention the salt. She focused on the water, a truth that hid the larger one. Abernathy listened, his gaze shrewd. A new spring on that cursed land was news. "Lumber costs money," he said gruffly. "So do nails, and my time." "I have no money," Nettie said plainly, "but I will have salt. I can rig a small evaporation pan. I can pay you in salt for preserving your winter meat." It was a common enough form of barter. Salt was a precious commodity, always in short supply on the prairie, most of it hauled at great expense from distant cities. Abernathy considered her offer. It was a risk, but there was something in the girl's steady gaze that he trusted. "All right," he agreed. "I'll come out tomorrow and see what you need." His help was the first link in a chain. While Abernathy measured for the well house, Nettie went to the general store, run by a widow named Martha Gable. Mrs. Gable was a sharp, pragmatic woman who had managed the store alone since her husband's death. Nettie, holding the wooden spoon from Silas in her pocket for courage, made her a similar offer. Credit for supplies, shovels, buckets, rope, in exchange for a future share of salt. Mrs. Gable, who paid dearly for the salt she sold, saw a good business proposition. "Show me you can produce it," she said, "and you'll have your credit." The community, which had whispered about the curse, began to watch with a different kind of interest. They saw Abernathy, a respected man, hauling lumber out to the Albright place. They saw Nettie, working tirelessly alongside him, digging post holes and setting beams. They saw the beginnings of a sturdy well house rising over the sinkhole. The narrative began to shift. Maybe the land wasn't cursed. Maybe it just needed the right kind of person, someone who wasn't afraid of hard work. Slowly, quietly, Nettie was rebuilding more than a homestead. She was building a reputation. The well house was the first victory. Under Abe Abernathy's guidance, Nettie learned to measure twice and cut once, to drive a nail straight and true, to set a post so it would stand against the prairie wind. The structure rose over the sinkhole, a sturdy little building of rough-sawn pine that enclosed the spring, protecting it from the elements and prying eyes. It had a heavy, lockable door and a winch system Abernathy designed, allowing her to haul buckets of the heavy brine with mechanical ease. Inside, away from the world, the glittering walls of salt were her secret kingdom. With the well house complete, she turned her attention to production. Using the credit from Mrs. Gable, she acquired large, shallow metal pans. She built a long, low furnace of stone and clay, a design she'd read about in a farmer's almanac, with a flue that would draw the heat evenly under the pans. The work was slow and grueling. She hauled bucket after bucket of brine, her shoulders and back screaming in protest. She fed the fire with driftwood collected from the creek and dried buffalo chips gathered from the prairie. Then she waited. The process was a kind of alchemy. As the water steamed away under the relentless Nebraska sun and the gentle heat of her fire, the salt began to appear, crystallizing at the edges of the pans, growing into a thick, white crust. She scraped it out with a wooden paddle, her heart pounding as she saw the sheer volume of it. It was whiter and finer than any salt she had ever seen. She laid it on clean canvas sheets to dry completely, breaking up the larger chunks until it was a mound of brilliant, glittering crystals. Her first harvest yielded nearly 50 pounds. She packed it into clean burlap sacks, stitched them shut herself, and loaded them into a wheelbarrow Abe Abernathy had loaned her. The 10-mile journey back to Providence was an act of triumph. When she walked into Gable's general store and set the sacks on the floor, a hush fell over the few customers inside. Mrs. Gable untied one of the sacks, took a pinch of the salt, and tasted it. Her eyes widened. "This is clean," she said, a note of awe in her voice. "Cleaner than the St. Louis salt." She weighed the sacks. "Your credit is paid, Nettie Granger," she announced, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "And I'll buy the rest, at a fair price." Word spread through Providence like a prairie fire. The cursed Albright place was producing salt. Good salt. In a land where preserving meat was the key to surviving the winter, this was revolutionary. Nettie was no longer the strange girl who bought the haunted homestead. She was becoming Nettie Granger, the salt woman. People began to change how they spoke to her. Farmers tipped their hats. The women in town, who had once eyed her with suspicion, now offered a nod of greeting. She became a point of interest, then of respect. She used her first earnings to buy a sturdy mule and a small wagon, ending her days of hauling by hand and foot. She hired a local boy, a lanky teenager named Eli, to help her with the heavy work of hauling brine and bagging salt. He was the son of a farmer whose land was failing, and the wages Nettie paid were a lifeline for his family. The Rankin brothers, a pair of burly, sullen men who ran a freighting business, began to watch her. She saw them on the street in town, their eyes lingering on her wagon, their expressions a mixture of greed and resentment. She remembered Elias Albright's warning and felt a chill, but she also felt the growing, unspoken support of the town. Her success was becoming their success. The salt she produced was making their lives more secure, and they would not let it be taken away easily. Nettie's world, once confined to the four walls of a storage room, expanded to the quarter section of land that was now truly hers. The soddy, once a damp and crumbling shelter, became a home. With her earnings, she bought glass for the window, letting in the vast prairie light. She installed a small, efficient cast-iron stove that filled the single room with a steady, comforting warmth. The dirt floor was covered with smooth, flat stones she hauled from the creek bed, and a colorful rag rug, purchased from Mrs. Gable, added a splash of brightness. The leaning barn was straightened and reinforced, its roof patched, its interior now housing her mule, a milk cow she'd bought, and a small flock of chickens that provided her with fresh eggs. Her life settled into a rhythm dictated not by the demands of others, but by the needs of her own enterprise. Mornings were for tending the animals and the small garden she had planted. Afternoons were for the salt. The work was still hard, but it was satisfying. It was the work of building, of creating value from the earth, with her own two hands. She became a familiar sight in Providence, her wagon loaded with sacks of salt, her mule pulling at a steady pace. She knew people by name now. Mr. Abernathy would call out a greeting from his forge. Mrs. Gable would have a cup of coffee waiting for her at the store. The farmers she sold salt to directly would ask after her well, their respect genuine. She was a part of the town's fabric, a vital thread in its economy. Small rituals began to form. Every Sunday, she would set aside her work. She would attend the small church in town, not out of the fearful obligation the Millers had instilled in her, but for the quiet sense of community. Afterwards, she often shared a meal with the Gables or the Abernathys. These were simple affairs, filled with practical talk of weather and crop prices, but they were a world away from the silent, leftover meals of her past. She was no longer an outsider looking in. She had a seat at the table. The threat of the Rankin brothers remained a shadow at the edge of her new life. They tried to challenge her claim at the land office, arguing that the spring was a public resource. But Mr. Henderson, the once smirking clerk, now saw Nettie as a significant contributor to the town's prosperity. Aided by a petition signed by half the farmers in the county, all of whom relied on her salt, her claim was upheld. The brothers then resorted to veiled threats, their wagons sometimes appearing on the road to her homestead, only to be met by the sight of Abe Abernathy or another of her allies, ostensibly there to fix a fence or deliver supplies, their presence a clear, unspoken message of protection. The community had closed ranks around her. They had invested in her, and they would defend their investment. The unwanted homestead had transformed. It was no longer a place of curses and sorrow. It was a place of life, of purpose. It was a refuge she had built herself, a source of authority earned through labor, and a home filled with the quiet warmth of self-reliance and belonging. One evening in early autumn, Nettie stood by the well house as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the enormous sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep purple. The prairie wind, that constant, restless presence, whispered through the tall grass, but it was no longer a sound of loneliness. It was the sound of her home. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from her own chimney and the faint, clean mineral smell of the drying salt. In the pocket of her apron, her fingers found the smooth, familiar shape of the wooden spoon Silas had carved for her so many years ago. She drew it out, its pale maple glowing in the fading light. It was a simple, honest tool made with care by a man who had seen a flicker of potential in a lonely, watchful girl. He had taught her the dignity of work, the value of a well-made thing. Inside the soddy, on a small shelf beside the stove, was another object she treasured. It was a piece of rock salt from the deepest part of the vein, a perfect, translucent crystal she had saved from her very first harvest. It represented the legacy of Elias Albright, a stranger from the past, who had also seen value where others saw only desolation. He had trusted the land, and he had trusted the future, a future that, by a strange turn of fate, had become hers. She held the spoon in one hand, its surface worn smooth by her own touch, and thought of the salt crystal inside. One object from a man who had offered her the first taste of kindness, the other from a man who had, through a message in a bottle, offered her a kingdom. Two men she would never see again, whose belief in the unseen had fundamentally shaped her existence. She looked down at her hands. They were not the hands of a young woman of 22. They were chapped, calloused, the nails cut short, the skin ingrained with the honest dirt of her land. They were the hands of a woman who knew how to build, to mend, to create. They were strong. They were hers. She thought of the Millers, of the single silver dollar meant to dismiss her, to erase 18 years of her life. They had cast her out with nothing, hoping she would disappear. They had underestimated her, just as everyone had underestimated this patch of land. They had seen a servant girl. Silas had seen a builder. They had seen a cursed homestead. Elias Albright had seen a hidden treasure. And in the quiet, patient work of her own two hands, she had proven the builders right. Nettie Granger was 22 and had been cast out with a single dollar. She had spent it on a patch of cursed land on the Nebraska prairie. It was the best dollar she ever spent. It had bought her more than a home. It had bought her a future written in salt, a community built on respect, and the quiet, unshakable dignity of her own strength. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience. If stories of quiet strength and hidden value speak to you, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who might need it. What overlooked thing in your own life holds a secret value? Let us know in the comments below.